Welcome to Podcrushed. Sophie's not here, as
we kicked her off the island, finally.
Yeah. You know, as you probably won't notice, I think.
But only because you can't tell female voices apart. So, you know,
Exactly,
as far as you know, Sophie was part of this episode. We miss Sophie, but Sophie is making herself happy today.
Yeah, we're on vacation?
She took the mandate. I think she's on vacation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're not even sure.
we don't know what Sophie's doing. She's at an outlet mall. So today's guest is an expert on happiness, and I have to ask you,
we're just getting
Ben,
right to it. We're not even going to rib each other a little bit before
this ties into the question that I was going to, if you were a little more patient.
All right,
I would be a little more happy.
So let's get to it.
I was going to ask you, Penn, sort of in keeping with the theme of the episode, what is one thing that made you really happy this week?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's always easy with the kids, right? There's always these like moments that their faces come alive. Like the 14-year-old, not so much, right? He's going through a phase where he's trying to dampen every single emotion like a true young man. Oh, sad. But the little ones, we have a 3-year-old. I mean, when his face lights up, it's just so pure. It's so easy to, at least for a moment, recognize gratefully, like that's subjectively great and should make me happy.
Yeah.
So then I ask, why am I miserable? What made me actually happy? This is gonna sound silly. I had a really, really incredible, deep conversation with my wife, with Domina.
Why is that silly?
That sounds like it's not silly, but
that sounds like what makes people happy.
It is actually, as you'll learn from our episode, but it's just on paper. It doesn't look that exciting.
Disagree. You're wrong, as always.
What about
you? Yeah. No, I've had a great week. Maybe two things that made me particularly happy this week. One of them, I feel like you guys will be like, this girl, can she ever shut up about her dog? Her dog and her dead mom, just again. But my dog Louie, when I got him, was like a wild devil child and has gradually, been less and less that. But lately, he's like in his meek era. He's just been so meek. I don't know how to explain it, but it just makes me so happy. He's just so sweet and like, oh my God, I love him so much. That's number one. But also, on Friday, this actually relates to what Dr. Santos will say too. I had a lot going on. I had been invited to go to this like jazz night at LACMA with some friends. And I was very busy and was going to cancel. But I was like, I feel like going out with people will make me happy. Like, I think that I should end this week. It wasn't a bad week, but I should end this week doing something that will bring a lot of joy. So I pushed myself to not cancel. And I often do cancel on things that are social that would be good for me. And it was so fun. I'd never been to LACMA. The music, the atmosphere, the picnic, the friends. It was just so nice. And I'm so happy that I did that. And it really ties in with what some of the tips that Dr. Santos will share for things that actually make us happy.
Yeah, so let's get to that then. We have Dr. Laurie Santos, who, if you don't know, is the host and creator, I should say, of the Happiness Lab, which is a super successful podcast. You probably know about it if you're listening to ours, I would think. If not, you really should go and listen to it. She has accomplished so much. I can't list them all, but she is the director of Yale's Comparative Cognition Lab, Rotary. She is the director of Yale's Canine Cognition Lab. She was the former head of Yale's Silliman College. And now she is she's teaching the most attended class at Yale ever. Actually, 1/4 of the Yale student body attended her class. She's doing incredible things, linking. Not linking. She's exploring the science of happiness, really. And what do we want more than to be happy? I really think you should listen to this episode and then go and listen to hers. Her whole podcast is phenomenal. We have Dr. Laurie Santos coming up right after the break. Welcome to Podcrushed. We're your hosts. I'm Penn.
I'm Sophie. And I'm Nava. And I think we would have been your middle school besties.
Miserable. I'm seeking happiness. Dr. Laurie Santos, I would call you absurdly high achieving, but not in like some, I don't know, pathological way. Like you just, it's really impressive what you've done. We love to spend time usually in the adolescence and coming of age of our guests. Your work is so compelling that I think we're going to spend most of the time there. However, to get a window into your mind now, I kind of want to know a little bit about your heart back then. So, like, if you can paint however broad or specific you want to get, just what was life like for you in New Bedford? Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Like sort of growing up, and who, just a snapshot of who Laurie Santos was at 12.
Yeah. So I think to answer that question, it helps to have a snapshot of where I was a little bit before that.
Yeah.
So very happy kid, had a little brother, family, grew up in a nice house in a neighborhood that wasn't so great. So it's kind of like we were doing sort of good in a neighborhood of folks who weren't doing so well. And then around the time I turned 12, my parents got divorced. We sort of had to move. I grew up a kind of very like skinny, straight-haired kid, and somehow puberty delivered both like more girth and chubbiness, and my hair got curly in the way it is now.
Yeah, right.
But at the time, it was this very awkward in between, like full-on frizz phase. And I was having some trouble at school, getting a little bullied and things. And so we decided, in part because of the move and in part because of that, to like switch schools. So it was a time of much change. It was a time of much kind of like thinking about my own identity and how I fit in. It was a time, honestly, of a lot of loneliness. And so it wasn't like, peak time for Dr. Laurie Santos. It was a dark period.
That's like consonant with almost everybody's experience here, except for like, I'm trying to think.
No, I don't think we've ever had a guest. Well, Ed Spalier's never had a bad moment.
That's right, Ed Spalier's. Let the record show that Ed Spalier's did not have an awkward story. I guess I'm curious, like, just a few things before we get into your work. Who was it that opened the door to you to be a scientist? Because, like, now, obviously, we have a lot of different rhetoric than we did back in the 70s and 80s. Like, you were a girl. You were a little girl, and very early on, it seems that you must have been getting into this. So, like, just can we know a little bit about that?
Yeah, honestly, it was a little bit later. So I remember kind of being good at science, being good at math, and really having the moment of like, oh, girls don't really do that stuff. Like, I was good at math throughout my time, and I remember in high school hearing like, oh, you don't really need that. Like, don't take calculus. You won't really need it. And so wound up even in college, like kind of playing catch up because of some of those decisions. Yeah.
But you went to Harvard.
I did go to Harvard.
Harvard.
Yeah.
But so what did you do to get into Harvard?
I know. I was just really good at what I did do, I think is maybe what happened. But I think a lot of that rhetoric was there. And part of my interest in psychology happened, almost as an accident. I wound up taking intro psych because it kind of seemed cool, but it was really like an extra class, like some other class that I wanted to take had like fallen through, and I sort of added it on. And I also had this sort of conceptual confusion about how office hours in college work. If you've been to college, it's like you go and ask professors a question. But in my like freshman brain, it got coded as like something I had to do, like a midterm to like pass the class. So I was like, oh man, this stupid office hours, I got to get this hour over with. And so I showed up first week of classes in my professor's office thinking that there would be like some procedure for office hours. And he was kind of confused about like, you don't have anything to ask me. Why are you here? So he's like, why are you here? Did you want to work in my lab or something? And I was like, work in your lab. That sounds cool.
Wow.
And so I started there, and the rest was history. So it was really a kind of confusion that got me started.
Is that what took you to, I don't remember the name of the island, but an island off of...
In Monkey Island in Puerto Rico, yeah. Right. So my day job was really studying animals. This was actually a lab I worked in before that. It was a lab that studied mental imagery and how you kind of can view the world and its different parts through the images you have in your mind. And at the time, the professor, when I started, because he wasn't expecting a new research assistant, I just kind of rolled through, he was obsessed with ice skating. So I started this project on whether ice skaters have better mental imagery than the rest of us. Fast answer is no. It was like a 2-year project that like went absolutely nowhere. But that was my glorious beginning.
If you recall, how would you at around 12 or 13 have been thinking about happiness? What was that to you?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think I, fell prey to a lot of the same biases my students have now, that happiness was ultimately about me getting good grades and doing well in school. I think not as extreme as the pressure that a lot of students face. I think it wasn't my end-all be-all. I was still spending a lot of free time hanging out with friends and just goofing around. Like, it wasn't as intense as I think a lot of teens face like life right now.
Did you have any, we always do have to ask, first crush or heartbreak? Do you have a story there?
I mean, so the sad thing is, this is going to date me, but I was really obsessed with New Kids on the Block.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
I was so obsessed at the time with Jordan Knight that I fought with my Catholic school to allow them to let my confirmation name be Jordan. If you're a nerdy Catholic, you know that confirmation names have to be some saint. And they're like, Jordan's not a saint. And I actually wrote an essay in 8th grade that the River Jordan.
I was going to say.
It featured prominently in the Bible.
So prominently.
And so they should let me do it. And I think they just gave up. They're like, fine, your confirmation name is Jordan. So first love, first heartbreak, Jordan Knight.
Wow. I also didn't know that you went to a Catholic school, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the transitions. So I'd kind of gone to Catholic school, think like small classrooms, like, 20 kids who know each other for a long time.
Yeah. And
so
that's where you were bullied.
That's why the bullying was a little rough. And
okay.
so then subsequently switched to public school where I was kind of a face in the crowd, and that worked out much better for high school.
Right.
I'm not sure how sharing stories like this relates to happiness, if there's a relationship, but the other question that we ask every guest is to share an embarrassing memory from that time, if you have one.
There was one time that we went, to like a Six Flags kind of amusement park, and they had, they have these like photo things. You can take like old time photos or cool photos. But one of the fake photo things they had was that you could be on the cover of like Teen Beat magazine, like a teen magazine, which again, rewinding to my childhood in the 90s was like a thing, right? Yeah. And I was like, oh my gosh, I want that. I want the 8x10 of me on the Teen Beat magazine. And I posed like for this, $12 picture thinking I looked like the most beautiful, the most cool that I've ever looked in my life. And I look at the photo now and I was just like, it was like total like fail, like just kind of like awkward, teen years kind of fail. Like it could have been on one of these Reddit threads, right? Yeah. And I think it just, showed that this transition period is hard for everyone, right? That we're all trying to make sense of our identity. We're all trying to do it the best we can, but sometimes it doesn't always go well.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about the science of the brain at this time? Developmentally?
Yeah. So I think a couple of things to say there. One is like your brain's not done yet at this point, but it's making all kinds of new connections, and it's really growing at this time. And a lot of the regions in which it is growing are these domains where you're kind of thinking about social connections. How do I think about other people? How do other people think about me, right? How do I think about risk in terms of what I'm going to do to fit in with the crowd, right? Like a lot of the regions that are developing in the brain are the regions that are making sense of your social position in the world. And I think that alongside what's happening in your bodies, where your bodies are developing systems to like, go out and form relationships and have sex and like, exactly. It's just such a tough time. And I think it, it reflects in the kind of chaos that people see. I think neurally there's like kind of a lot of growth and change and chaos. And in life, there's a lot of growth and change and chaos too.
Do you think that because it sounds like what you've been doing somewhat systematically, it's not all you've been doing, but it's almost like debunking myths about happiness so that people can actually be happy.
That's right. That's right.
And although you've not successfully saved the world, do you like, I'm thinking right now, of course we think about this a lot on this show, but in the context of having you here, I'm suddenly like, it's crystallized in a different way. It feels to me like the myths that adults carry on and perpetuate and believe in and invest in around happiness really fall so heavy on the shoulders of kids growing up.
Totally.
Like, much.
And I think this has really, gotten worse, right? I think our ideas about the fact that, money will make you happy, we're getting all these accolades at work, like being successful will make you happy, kind of pushing yourself, hustle culture, go, 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 that'll make you happy. These are the things that adults fall prey to, but these are the things that parents are instilling in middle schoolers, right? Yeah. It's why, I as a 12-year-old never thought about like, I was like, oh, maybe I'll go to college, but I wasn't like, I must get this on my SATs and all my extracurriculars must be in this line so I could, feed them to an admissions officer. Like, this kind of accolade stress is getting in much earlier, even during middle school, where you see a lot of middle schoolers not just kind of enjoying school because it's like school and this fun place you learn, but it's this stressful place, right?
Totally.
Yeah. And it's not just kind of academics in school, right? It's a lot of students' extracurricular activities. I hear from middle schoolers and teens who talk about how much they started playing soccer or running track because they like loved it, and now they hate it because it feels like there's something they have to do, right? Where their performance matters so much. And so I think one of the things that adults mess up for kids is they really build in that these extrinsic rewards are going to be what makes you happy. Your grades and your performance and that trophy at the end. And there are data, not just that those things don't make us as happy as we think, but that they can sometimes impede our happiness. That when we get stuck up on extrinsic rewards, it makes it harder to get the intrinsic rewards that come out of the things that we do in life.
Right. That makes me think about, I think it is your first episode. Is your first episode The Unhappy Millionaire? Or is that like
very close? Yeah.
Very close.
Yeah.
Okay. It's like one of the tent poles, you know,
Yeah.
I think, right? Because it so clearly dispels some like major, so our biggest myths about happiness. And I'm just thinking about when you're talking about what I think was called hedonic adaptation, where, if I'm getting this right, the good things that we imagine don't last as long in terms of what they provide for our happiness spikes. And the bad things that we fear are never really as bad as we think they're going to be. And our ability to adapt and be resilient is greater than we often believe.
Exactly.
So it's sort of like we're imagining higher highs and lower lows. And in reality, we have, I don't want to frame it negatively. It's like we have a more stable, maybe. We have like maybe a more just sort of stable and consistent experience.
Yeah, it's really the circumstances of life don't affect us as much as we think.
Wow.
And I think this is two consequences for teens, right? One is that the good things aren't going to be as good as you think, right? Getting that perfect grade, getting into the perfect college, having that, boy or girl call you
Totally,
back
yeah.
or check in, right? Like those good things just aren't going to keep you sustained as long as you think. But even more important for teens, I think, is the flip side, right? Which is that the bad things aren't going to stick around forever. If I could talk to 12-year-old Laurie to tell her, that, one weird conversation that your friend had, or that note that got passed that fell on the floor, that, that person in class read, that bad grade, like those aren't going to matter at all for your happiness. They're just these like blips in the big scheme of things. And I think we really don't realize that. And I think we especially don't realize that in teen years where everything can feel, so much huger than it's felt before.
It makes me think for adults, actually, we've just taken that and like, we're like, no, the note in class doesn't matter. But my promotion at work, like,
That matter, yeah, I like it, yeah.
Like and of course they're not equivalent. Like they do have more implications, but
for our happiness, maybe not. Maybe not so much.
Great, you said it. I don't want to say it. I'm not the expert.
We asked our listeners to submit questions for unhappiness, and I mentioned this earlier, but I think I don't want to exaggerate. We got hundreds. We might have gotten about 1,000. At some point, I couldn't keep sorting through them, but I did try to pull the ones that came up the most. The one that came up the most was, how would you define happiness? Is it subjective or are there objective markers?
Yeah, it's kind of a tricky question, right? Like one of the things I wish as a scientist is we could have an objective way to measure happiness. Like there's like a little happiness thermometer and you could put it in and be like, you're 98.6, unhappy or something. Like that doesn't exist. The only way we have to ask people is subjective. We give these sort of surveys about, all things considered, how happy are you? Or which of these positive emotions have you experienced? And that can sound like a cheesy like BuzzFeed survey, like some, TikTok survey or something like that. But there's tons of actual psychometrics, which is like the real super nerdy science of like validating these measures. And it turns out that these seemingly simple sounding like happiness surveys, like all things considered, how happy are you with your life, the sort of one item measure, it correlates with things like detailed interviews of your friends and family members. Or if I did some like machine learning analysis on your like journals and social media posts, how much emotion you are showing. And so it is subjective, but it's good subjective, right? There's subjective measures that are pretty valid. And in some ways, it's kind of what we want when we ask, if we're looking at happiness to try to study, how can we make you happier, right? A lot of my work is giving people these interventions and practices they can use to feel better. Ultimately, what I want to change is not some thermometer measure of their happiness. I want them to say, yeah, actually, after I did this intervention, all things considered, I'm happier with my life. I feel better. I have more positive emotion. So it kind of works. But a different way to answer the question is sort of what should be in our definition of happiness. And I think researchers often think of happiness as having these two parts. It's kind of being happy in your life and being happy with your life. So being happy in your life is your sense of positive emotion, right? I feel good today. It just feels good to be me. And it's not the absence of negative emotions. We might come to this, but there's lots of data that a good and flourishing life involves having negative emotions. But you want the ratio to be pretty decent between the positive and negative. That's kind of being happy in your life. But you also want to be happy with your life. You want to feel like things are going well. You want to think, all things considered, I'm satisfied with my life. I have purpose and so on. And it's worth noting that sometimes these things dissociate. You might have people who, think of your favorite TikTok star who's like, living their best hedonic life and they're on planes and airplanes or whatever. But maybe how they think their life is going is like empty and purposeless and whatever. And we sometimes have the opposite where we're doing something really meaningful that matters to us and we think is important, but it comes with some negative emotions. We're talking about teens, but I often think to like new parents here. When you have a newborn, that positive emotions down the toilet and you're not sleeping, it's a mess. But meaning wise, you're feeling really happy. And so best case scenario is we're bumping both of those things up.
Right. When did you get into happiness specifically? Because it sounds like you really got into psychology, and then like when did it become happiness and how did that click over for you?
Yeah, I was kind of interested in psychology for a long time, from ice skaters to studying animals and how they think and all these kinds of things in the field. But happiness as an interest started specifically when I took on a new role as a professor. So I'd been teaching at Yale for a long time, but then around about 5 years ago, I took on a new role on campus where I became a head of college, which meant I lived with students on campus. And I'd been a professor, I'd seen students all the time, but I hadn't seen students in the trenches. And what I saw, honestly, just sort of shocked me. I mean, I was seeing this college student mental health crisis up close and personal where students were reporting feeling stressed and anxious and depressed all the time. I saw, cases of suicidality, panic attacks, right? Just utter overwhelm. And I was thinking like, man, we as university professors, we're not doing our job unless we're solving for this. Students aren't learning if they're kind of experiencing this much mental health dysfunction.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I'm like, so, I'm a nerdy psychologist. I'm like, my field should have some tips for how we can deal with this. So I kind of retrained in this sort of happiness science to sort of put all these tips together, and then decided to teach a class on campus about it. Thinking it's like a new class and a few students would show up. And the first time I taught it became Yale's largest class in over 300 years. We had over 1,000 students. It was a quarter of the entire student body showed up.
You now have still on record the most attended class. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, and it was like kind of a logistical nightmare because there's not really spots on campus other than the football stadium where a quarter of the student body can be at once.
So were you teaching in a football stadium?
We weren't. It was cold. Connecticut is
only because it was cold, not because it wasn't warranted.
We taught in a concert hall, which is next
That's
best
amazing.
thing.
You're an actual rock star on campus. I mean, like that's.
Oh yeah, you must be the most popular professor at Yale ever. Another question, and this kind of maybe relates to the Unhappy Millionaire. By the way, that's one of my favorite podcast episodes of any podcast that I've ever listened to. And there was about a year where I was very obnoxious and I would like send it to everyone and be like, this is
She kept on calling me an Unhappy Millionaire.
I did send it to
Penn.
Penn.
No, but would you relax?
This is why. No, I was like, if we're all so steeped in capitalism, we have to listen to this over and over again. I'm sure I was like very self-righteous about it, but it's such an amazing episode. Everyone should listen to it because we are so steeped in capitalist mentality, and it really debunks a lot of things. It's such an amazing episode. So I wanted to ask you, what are three, I don't know why the number 3, but what are 3 sort of popular misconceptions about happiness, and what are 3 things that are overlooked that actually contribute to happiness from your point of view?
Yeah, no, great question. I mean, I think one you highlighted in this Unhappy Millionaire episode is like money, right? I mean, if you survey incoming first-year college students about the most important thing in life, they'll say it's to have really good finances and to be rich. And researchers have been tracking that over time, and that number has been going up since the 1950s. Before in the 1950s, like, some kids said, oh, that's important. But now, like, pretty much every, versus, for example, having a good philosophy on life and having purpose in life, the answer to that question has actually gone down over time. So less and less, fewer and fewer students have said that that's important. So we definitely think money matters. And it is true that money matters if you don't have a lot of it, right? I mean, it's worth saying that, things like a universal income, things like making sure we alleviate poverty, those are important things. But when you hit a certain level of middle class income, estimates vary. Like there's been some quotes in literature that something like around a salary of $75,000 US or something like that. We could quibble, but at a certain point, your happiness levels off. In other words, if you get more money, you're just not going to be happier. And I think that that's a really hard truth for a lot of people. When you pick your job, my college students are deciding between 2 jobs. They often pick the one that has the higher salary, right? Even if it moves them away from their family and their friends and the hours are terrible, right? And so I think money is really a big misconception. I think a second misconception is about kind of the importance of you and self-care and your individual success and me, right? So much of our culture is about kind of building up the resources that we have and the rewards that we get. And by and large, most of the happiness science shows that that kind of doesn't matter as much, that we get much more happiness bang for our buck by investing in other people, whether it's our money or our time or our energy. We kind of get that wrong. And I think a final thing that we get wrong a lot about happiness is that happiness is about being happy all the time. By that, I mean it's like positive emotion all the time. Any challenge or negativity or sadness or anger, that is bad. And we kind of want to get rid of that. And really, the research shows that we need negative emotions as signals. They help us kind of figure stuff out in life, but also just for a life of flourishing. You want to kind of have a balance between positive and negative emotions. And a lot of the things that bring happiness, finding meaning, finding purpose, is going to come with some challenge and some tough spots. And so I think, and this is something I think we get right more often in the physical health domain, right? Like I know if I'm going to get fit and go to the gym, I'm going to have to lift some weights, and that's going to be a pain, and like my muscles are going to stretch, and they might be sore afterwards, but I can see physical health on the other side of that. I think we forget that mental health comes on the other side of some of these negative emotions. So those are some of the things we get wrong. And I think some of the things we miss, social connection being one of them, right? That just, it's not about us. But then the flip side is like, it really is about other people. And I think that this is something our teens today are missing out on a lot, right? If you just look at time use patterns, teens today are around other humans less often, because they have this sort of crutch of connecting over screens, but screens don't necessarily have the same psychological benefit of in-person social connection or doing nice things for other people. So I think we miss out on the power of other people. I think we miss out on the power of being present and just like noticing what's going on. Here again, I think the screens are kind of messing us up because they're a really easy way to stay distracted all the time.
Podcasts are very healthy for our mental health.
Podcasts are fun.
Right?
Yeah, podcasts you talk about with friends, you recommend the Unhappy Millionaire, like that's cool, but really it's like the other screen time that's, potentially problematic. And then I think a final thing that like the culture really messes up, and I think I see this in my college students, I think is definitely true in middle school and high school students too, is just kind of an attitude of positivity, noticing the good things in life, being grateful. Sounds so cheesy, but the wholesome stuff kind of matters for the direction that our attitude goes. And again, I think this is something that's kind of countercultural right now. I look at the memes that my college students make, and none of the memes are like wholesome memes about good stuff. They're all like complaining about the dining hall, about whatever, about the terrible things in life. And it can be so easy with just the content that's out there to get stuck on the negative. But kind of training yourself to find the good in the world can be really powerful for happiness. I think we forget how powerful that can be.
Is the idea that there should be a baseline, and a lot of us don't, or is there like how do you talk about that? How would it's not a well articulated question. I'm recognizing that, but like, what is that? What is a baseline level of happiness like?
Yeah, I think one way to answer that question is, and I think this sort of fits with a lot of what people think, is that we're kind of just like happy or we're not. Like there's some built-in thing, whether it's genetic or whatever, that's like you're like a happy person or you're like a not so happy person. And there is some evidence that in fact, when it comes to the genetics, when it comes to what's called heritability, there is some idea that actually is the case. So genetically speaking, like some of us are happier than others. And you could think of the biology of this, right? Some of us have more stress hormones or some whatever. But it's not nearly as much as we think. It's probably maybe around 40%, heritability estimates of happiness. And what that means is two things, right? One is that happiness isn't built in. But then it also means the flip side of that, which is that we can control a lot of our happiness. The problem is we control it the wrong way. We go after money and accolades. What we should be trying to do is to control it with our behavior and our mindset. Things like social connection, being more present, being more grateful, and so on.
Yeah, it makes me think that happy as a word has lost so much meaning.
Totally.
Like we don't have a great language around happiness. We say happy and it sounds like very thin.
Yeah. And it probably encompasses all these things. I think we need better terms. This is the spot where I think, the ancients had it better. Aristotle had concepts like eudaimonia, which is a sort of term for like the flourishing life, a life of meaning and purpose and connection. I think it's pretty flat when it comes to happiness these days.
So that actually relates to another question. These things are all connected, and maybe it's like we don't want to get in a semantic kind of debate here, but like, what is the difference between happiness and joy and contentment? And are they distinct, or should we be thinking of them as deeply interrelated?
I like to think of being happy is kind of getting happiness. And that has these sort of two parts, kind of being happy in your life, your positive emotion, and then being happy with your life, how you think of it. Joy and contentment, I would say a lot of those are emotions, right? Like you experience joy from something that's happening. Contentment, a particular kind of emotion where it's not like it's positive, but it's not like that extreme. It's kind of just your baseline, sort of present and happy. And so I think we can kind of get confused when it comes to these terms. And honestly, it's just a mess. What we try to do in the class is just define the terms at the outset and let's just be really careful about, using the terms in these very particular ways.
Well, because so many of us were coming to this kind of discussion as novices here, just, new to the conversation, this language. Let's reiterate, even though you've now said it in two different ways. What is that? Just because I feel like I probably need it, everyone listening probably needs it. Those two factors that you just said, it's happy in your life and happy with your life, right? Those
Correct,
are the two kind of ways.
And if you think of those terms, it kind of starts to make sense. Like, what would it mean to be happy in my life? Like, oh, that would mean it feels good to be me during the day-to-day, right? Like lots of positive emotions. And again, we don't want to get stuck. Like probably some negative emotions, there's going to be up and downs, right? But like overall, there's a lot of laughter and joy and contentment and pleasure and these kinds of things, right? That's kind of how it feels in your life. But what would it mean to be happy with your life? Like maybe if you just had all that hedonic pleasure, that'd be fine, but you kind of want more. You want to be moving towards goals. You want to be like feeling like you're connected with other people. You want to have a sense of purpose and meaning that you're doing something that matters. That's kind of like, okay, how do you think your life is going? And so if we kind of are happy in our lives with all this positive emotion and then happy with our lives, like we think about our lives as going well, then those two things together, I think, give you like a happy life overall.
Are there any populations or demographics that we see are like statistically happier than others? Because I'm thinking of social factors here.
Totally.
Like that's.
Yeah, there's a lot of good work sort of studying happiness cross-culturally, right? Some of you may have heard about this thing called the World Happiness Report. If you know, in March, they kind of list like Norway and Scandinavian countries are happier than other countries. And there is some there, right? I think a lot of countries that have a lot of sort of social protections in place wind up being happier. So if you look at the World Happiness Report, typically it's countries like Denmark or Norway or Sweden, countries in Scandinavia that wind up happier than, say, the United States or even places in Asia and so on. And one big reason is that they have social structures that promote a lot of the behaviors that we think of as helping you be happier. So take social connection, right? If you look at a place like Denmark, they have kind of less time at work, right? And enforced kind of time so you can be part of your clubs. Parents get to go home with their families a lot earlier. There are like social safety nets, right? So there's a universal income so people can not have to feel like they're working all the time and things like that. And so you have more time for social connection. There's also like cultural things about like enforced rest and presence. Some of you may have heard this term like hygge, which is this sort of Scandinavian term for kind of like being present in the like cozy space with like candles and cozy blankets and things like that. And that's just kind of a culturally shared attitude of just kind of being present and maybe grateful, especially in like the cold of winter where you get in Scandinavia, it's kind of a mess. And so the idea is we do see these differences across nations about some are happier than others, but it's not like those nations are just genetically built to be happier.
Of course not, yeah.
Those nations are doing things and have social structures set up that are good at promoting happiness.
Right.
This is, no one submitted this question, and it's maybe a little more political than you might want to, so you maybe don't want to answer it, but I've been thinking about this actually since listening to the Unhappy Millionaire and doing some research on wealth. I used to work at the UN, and while the UN is sort of like really, there's a lot of, common agreement that we should eradicate poverty, it's very hard to introduce the concept of regulating wealth and sort of capping extreme wealth. And the organization that I worked for was really often trying to introduce that concept. It was like no buy-in, like nobody else wanted to really be, not many people wanted to be part of that conversation. And I remember listening to that episode and feeling really angry. Like there's no justification. It doesn't make anyone happier, but it destabilizes communities when certain individuals are allowed to hoard so much wealth. And so I wonder if you have thoughts on like how extreme wealth contributes to social ill. And why you think we allow it. Like, why is it so steeped in our collective mindset that wealth is so important and that it shouldn't have any sort of conditions?
Yeah, I have a lot. I mean, we could do several podcast episodes on what I have to say about this question. Yeah, I mean, I think I have exactly the same intuition that you did, Nava, which is like it does seem like if you look at the happiness science that as you reach a certain wealth level, more money is not going to make you happy. So like, why should we allow people to be ultra billionaires, right? Like definitely when you get to that level, it's just not making people happier. And the flip side is also true that people at lower income levels, if they could just get an infusion of cash, would wind up being much happier, right? And so I think the happiness science suggests like a lot of policies about redistribution of wealth, right? You're not going to be hurting the overall flourishing and well-being of the rich people, but you'd be helping a lot the flourishing and well-being of like the not so rich people. So why are people against it? I think one of the reasons is that we have this bias of hedonic adaptation, right? We don't realize that we get used to stuff. So I think like, well, you know, I have this much money now. If I got more, I'd only be happier. So I think one of the reasons that many people kind of fight, are kind of not interested in these sort of measures of sort of redistributing wealth is they think, well, maybe someday I'll be lucky enough to hit the lottery or get a promotion and I'll be wealthier. And I don't want people taking that money from me because obviously I'll personally be happier if I have more wealth. But probably you're not going to get that wealthy. Like most of us are not going to become Bezos, you know, overnight tomorrow. And even if you did, you might not be happier. So I think it's both we kind of disbelieve the evidence about money and happiness, but also we have these biases to think like more and more and more, if I only got more, I would be happier. And I think this is true in so many different domains, right? Where we also see that people really respond negatively to a lot of policy interventions that are about giving money directly, for example. Like, you know, how should we help homeless people? You know, we'll have these different programs and things. Or like, actually, you could just give homeless people money and then they could like get a home and things like that. But people are like, oh no, you know, those people will, you know, buy substances with them that I don't want them to buy, or they won't make good decisions. And, you know, but actually so much of the data shows that if you just gave people more money, they would be happier and they'd use it correctly and use it in the ways that you would kind of want them using it. And so, yeah, I think a lot of our biases have these very clear policy implications about what the United Nations should be doing, what governments should be doing, how we should be restricting capitalism. But these biases of our mind are so insidious, we think, but not for me. I really want the possibility of getting super wealthy because that, will make me happy, even though the data show it probably won't. A lot of the seeds of early capitalism came out around the time when we were thinking about things like scarcity and thinking about things like the invisible hand, this idea that, you know, they will like lift all boats and things like that. It was also coming around the times of, you know, Darwin and Darwinian theory, where it's like survival of the fittest and competition, right? And I think Darwin was right about many solitary animals when it comes to the fitness of your genes. But even Darwin recognized that we shouldn't necessarily apply that exclusively to social species like humans, right? Where there's a lot of evolutionary pressures for things like altruism and doing nice things for other people. And, you know, Darwin would say like that works because then we get, you know, reciprocation and we get our own.
Which is still a very like kind of myopic way of thinking about it.
But ultimately, when it comes to our psychology, we might not be built like in this myopic kind of capitalist way. What resonates with our psychology might be being more social, doing nice things for others, like creating community. That's where our sense of meaning and purpose might really come from. That might ultimately make us feel better. I think the failure of our psychology is that we don't have good intuitive theories about that. In other words, we don't recognize that most of our happiness would come from doing nice things for others. And there are these like lovely studies that show this, right? You know, there's some work by Liz Dunn, who's at the University of British Columbia, where she does these studies where she hands people money on the street and she tells them either, hey, spend it on yourself and treat yourself, or hey, spend this on somebody else and do something nice for your community or for someone else. And she asks people to predict which of these will make you happier. And people overwhelmingly think spending on myself going to make me happier. Yeah. But then she runs a study and she finds it's exactly the opposite, right? Amazing. And so I think part of the problem is that in some ways, maybe capitalism was so successful because our intuitive theories of the human mind, in part informed by some of the stuff we were talking about, but I think just like, you know, our minds think that we'll be happier by investing in ourselves. And the data suggests it's really just the opposite. I mean, this is by and large, I think, one of the biggest problems of our mind is that our own theories about how our mind works, a lot of those are wrong. And so that means we're all investing in our happiness. We're putting time in, we're putting the work in, but we're putting the wrong work in, both as individuals and as societies.
The way you're saying this, it makes me think like if we could just lift off that, and it feels thin, these theories, you know? It's like these theories are kind of impressed on us. And it's like, I feel like if we could just lift them off and just like be ourselves more, so much would work itself out and be a lot easier, far more than we anticipate.
I think so. And I think even, a lot of the kind of processes that happen in capitalism, if we could start listening to these things, we'd get closer. I mean, and I think that there's this stuff is changing. I think there's a new set of economists who are looking at these data really seriously and saying, wait, hang on, like we are getting this wrong. There's this lovely new study that just came out of the University of Oxford that's looking at the topic of happiness at work. Like what makes us happy at work? And people think like, oh, it must be, if you're earning more money, right? If you double your salary, that will make you happy at work, right? Like we have these kind of predictions about, or that I'm like getting, benefits from my office, like rewards for me will make me happier at work. But then researchers actually look at what it is. They have this wonderful data set that comes from Indeed, this job website that reviews everybody's jobs. They have 15 million data points where people rated their companies on all these factors and studied their happiness. And so they look, and it turns out, salary, fair pay, that's important up to a point. But it's kind of middle of the pack when it comes to your happiness of all the factors they look at. The biggest one is a sense of belonging at work. It's that you have social connection. You feel like your work matters, that you're not just like a cog in this big machine, that like what you do matters to people. And the more important thing, and the reason I think it's so relevant for this capitalism discussion is they look at, okay, well, what are the consequences of a bunch of people in your organization being happy? Because they've got 50 million people. They can say, are the companies with the happiest people doing better in terms of their profits?
They must be.
They must be. They pick the top 100 companies, and they find that those companies, if you had invested in those companies like back in the 90s or back in 2000, you would wind up beating the S&P 500, which is the main metric of people's investments of what you should invest in.
And then you'd be wealthy and miserable is the irony.
It would all come
wealthy and socially good. But this is the point. It's like I think we think like, oh, we need to pay attention to like all this, like normal capitalismisms. But like actually just who's socially connected, who's happy, these things are going to wind up mattering much more than we think.
It's totally just so sense. Like obvious.
Just as an aside,
in a way,
I don't remember where I read it. I'm terrible about that. But I very recently read a study or like an excerpt from a study that said that people who do like, if someone does an act of service for you, they used to think that the person who received the act of service would like be more bonded with the person who did something for them. But it's actually the person who does something for you who feels a stronger bond for you. So the article was suggesting like if you like someone, you should ask them to do something nice for you because they're going to bond with you. And then they're going to want to like do more nice things for you. And I thought that was so interesting. And like, it is the opposite of what I would have expected, but it makes sense given everything you're saying. Like we feel happy when we serve others. So we bond with the people that we serve, that we do nice things for. It makes us like them even more. Just so interesting.
We actually have a new episode of we're doing an upcoming season on kind of all the things we get wrong with social interaction and friendships.
Oh, I love that.
And we have a whole episode on ask for help more often because we think like, oh, I don't want to put somebody in an awkward position, or I don't want to get rejected. I don't want to say no. But actually, you're helping other people's happiness by letting them help you. And so why not kind of, boost the pie? I think this is maybe the major error of capitalism is that we think in there's sort of this like zero-sum game that like my win is your loss. That's sort of richly embedded in how we think about the economy and everything. And everything in the happiness work suggests these cases where the pie increases, the better we do.
Win.
My win is your win,
and
right?
your win is my win.
Exactly.
Like, and my loss is your loss.
Exactly.
It's actually like if science is showing us that, like for F's sake, can we just get beyond who's going to devise a system?
This is how I know he really respects you, Laurie, because
it's
going to use the F word normally. So this is a sign of great. This might be our first episode that isn't explicit. So this is great.
No, it's because I want my children to listen to this episode.
Well, I was going to say, I honestly think it's going to come from the next generation. I think, I have, my Yale class, I have an online class that's just for middle school and teenagers called The Science of Wellbeing for Teens, where we kind of redo all Yale content, just, kind of more in middle school and examples that,
awesome.
Middle schoolers can resonate with. And the stuff I hear from these students is like, this doesn't fit with everything people are telling me. And like, and this is BS, right? Like I want to push back. Like we need to change the system. And so I think the young people today realize like they're seeing the disconnect. They're seeing that we need a major course correct in how we do so much stuff. And I'm really hopeful that they'll learn these principles about happiness and what really matters, and that they'll help the older folks with a bit of a course correct.
Yeah.
Totally.
Okay, another area we haven't broached that came up a lot in many different ways, but maybe we can summarize it, is what is the relationship between romantic love and happiness? And then this question it's very specific, and I don't know if you'll have an answer, but someone wanted to know, can a single person or can single people really be as happy as happily married people?
Good question. I'll take the second one first since it's more specific. Lots of studies about happiness and marriage and these things. And it's really a story about hedonic adaptation, unfortunately. So, just before you get married, you're very happy with your relationship. Then you get married and you sort of this peak of happiness. And that peak is like highest when you first get married, maybe for the first year after marriage. But then if you start surveying people's happiness in like year 3, year 4, year 5, you kind of just go back to baseline. And so it is the case that good relationships give us like lots of social connection and so on. But like so many things that we know from happiness, like just getting to, like happily ever after in the like Disney sense of romantic relationships or finding your perfect partner, like it's unless you do things to really invest in that happiness, you're just going to kind of naturally go back to baseline.
That makes me think of like marriage or like a committed relationship is a space where you can do those things, where you're engaging in the behavior that it's like service to one another. Actually,
exactly. So it doesn't have to. So and whenever we talk about these cases of hedonic adaptation, it's kind of like that's the default. Without some work and effort, you're just going to go back to baseline. And sadly, that's what happens on average for most marriages. But with some work and effort.
And by the way, I just want to say it's like it's because we're not taught any of this.
Exactly.
You go back to baseline in any relationship because you've never been told that you have to. I don't want to say work because we've talked a lot about that on the show and how it's kind of is a misconception around it.
Yeah.
But you have to you have to be active.
Intentional,
You have to be proactive and intentional. Yes, I like that.
Yeah, and I think, I think this is something that, again, if I was designing middle school or if I was a middle schooler myself, I'd be so angry about. It's like, we have to take, I don't know, like math and history and this, and that stuff's important, but like, where are we getting taught emotional intelligence? Where are we getting taught like appropriate strategies for social connection? Like we take gym. Like I could have gotten rid of gym straight through 12 through 15 and been just as physically healthy as I am right now, so yeah.
That's a great point. And then can single people be happy?
Oh,
statistically?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, I think, again, there's so many domains in which we fall prey to what researchers call the arrival fallacy, which is, if only blank happened, then I would be happy. If only I got a boyfriend or girlfriend, then I would be happy. If only I got married, I would be happy. If only I got into a certain college, if only I wound up with this accolade at work. We think we get the thing and then we're happy. But the research suggests we're wrong. My colleague at Harvard, Dan Gilbert, who's in he was in the Unhappy Millionaire, lots of episodes. He's fond of saying, happily ever after only works if you have about 5 minutes left to live.
Yeah, I love that. I laughed out loud when he said it. In your episode, he said 3 minutes. So
3 minutes. So it's even shorter.
You've tried to increase it just a little bit. There's not a quote, but like just a little colloquialism I've heard recently that the struggle we have in modernity and capitalism and like especially Western culture, I think, is that we're more like human doings than human beings. We're obsessed with this idea that we have to do the thing, acquire the thing. But what you're talking about is like we don't realize that there's something about presence or something about like the art of just being and realizing I am who I am. I don't know what else to say about that because it's not what I study.
No, I mean, I think this is something that we all had a little bit more of a realization of in the context of the pandemic, right? Like both, I think like middle schoolers who were doing a billion, going to this thing, doing homework, blah, blah. And that kind of came to a screeching halt. Definitely for the adults in the room who maybe stopped doing their work in the same way. Some folks who were laid off, some folks who just like kind of had to chill a little bit in a different way. I think we all kind of had the realization that like maybe all this doing is not making us as happy as we think. And I think we had moments where just because it was so quiet, we had these times of like presence with like the morning coffee or walking around outside when it was quiet out, right? I think we all had these moments to kind of realize that it's really the being present part that's the journey of life.
So much.
And this is the sort of alternative to this idea of the arrival fallacy, is really thinking about your goals as a journey, right? It's not so much that I will be happily ever after when I get, married or I find a partner, but along the journey of learning more about my partner and kind of figuring this stuff out, figuring these things about me as I go through the dating life and whatever, I'm gonna get there. Same thing with work accolades. I'll be happy if I make this amount of money. No, you'll be happy along the journey of focusing on your goals, maybe failing a little bit, maybe kind of learning about yourself and growing along the way. These are the things that matter more. It's the journey that matters for happiness, not the arrival.
Okay, one was if I'm in a depressive state, we got several variations of this. Besides medicine, what helps people overcome depressive states?
Yeah, honestly, one of the things is getting social, right? And honestly, if you're feeling depressed, try to think of quick ways you could do something nice for someone else, whether that's doing something nice for a sibling, giving a compliment to your parent, or doing something you wouldn't normally do around the house. If you feel pretty socially connected at school, can you text a friend and ask how they're doing? Often we get out of states of kind of feeling yucky ourselves by doing for others. And it doesn't have to be this enormous thing. It can just be getting a little other-oriented. And that does two things. One is you get the kind of happiness hit that comes from doing for others. But the second is that you get out of self-focus. Sometimes that depressive moment is really just this ruminative spiral where you're just like beating yourself up over and over again. And just the act of focusing on somebody else can take you out of self-focus. That'd be one strategy. Another strategy is to kind of find ways to get present, right? And these are techniques that you would often hear, if you go to clinical therapy or something like that, right? And especially not even as necessarily for depression, but especially if you're feeling a lot of anxiety, which often goes with depression, right? Is like, what's a few things I can see? What are something I can hear? What does it feel like, in my feet right now, in my bottom right now, in my hands right now? Just like getting present. And what that does is, again, it can kind of knock you out of that normal depression spiral of like worry and rumination and the things that normally come up. So get social and get present.
Okay, the other question that I wanted to ask you, which came up a lot, is what is the relationship between religion or spirituality and happiness?
Oh, fabulous. You got some great questions, honestly. So lots of work has looked at religion and happiness. There seems to be a pretty strong correlation between individuals who are religious and individuals who are happier. But interestingly, it doesn't seem to be about your religious beliefs, like I believe in God or I believe it, we list out your religious beliefs. It seems to be about behaviors that are associated with religion. So what do I mean? If you're religiously observant, whether you're Jewish or Catholic or Muslim, you often have to go to something that's pretty social. You go to services, or you go to church, or you pray with a bunch of other folks. So that's social connection right there. You're often engaged in things like charity, right? For many religious traditions, this is sort of brought up. Often you're engaged in practices that allow you to be really present. So things like prayer or meditation. Many religious traditions come with practices of rest, which we haven't talked about a lot, but the data suggests really matter for happiness, just having a little free
Let's
time.
talk about that after religion.
Yeah, that would be great.
And so it seems like what the data are showing is that religious individuals are happier, but it doesn't really matter what you believe. What matters is what you do. And I think that that's helpful for folks of us who maybe want to come to happiness from more of a secular perspective. I mentioned I was in Catholic school, but these days I'm like a proper atheist. I can't believe I was confirmed, Jordan, BDM'd, whatever. But yeah, I think a lot of those practices are ones where it helps to be in a religious tradition, because that means the people around you are sort of doing some of these things naturally. But we can kind of build in our own local cultures to do a lot of those things as well. So yeah, religion, spirituality, and happiness, really important. And those are organized religions, but I think there's also lots of evidence that kind of other transcendent practices make us happier. They give us that sense that our life matters. So I'm thinking of things like positive emotions like awe, for example.
Totally.
Like you hear an amazing piece of music, or you look at a sunset or a beautiful thing in nature. Those are the kinds of things that can make us feel like it's not about us, right? There's something bigger than us.
Yeah.
And I think this is a main message of a lot of the work in happiness. Whenever we can get out of self-focus and get to other focus, whether that's doing something nice for somebody else, having a sense like it's not all about us, because look at nature, look at, a spiritual figure or something like that. All these things wind up making us a little happier.
You want to talk about rest, right, Penn? As sort of the next.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can we talk about that?
Yeah. I mean, rest, I think this is, you mentioned this distinction between a human being and a human doing.
Yeah.
I think it takes a lot for us to shake ourselves out of doing mode. And that means that we often don't prioritize rest. We don't prioritize just having some free time. But the data really show that that matters a lot. In fact, research shows that kind of financial wealth affluence is not as important for our happiness as what's often called time affluence, which is just having a little bit of free time. In fact, that if you self-report the opposite of time affluence, which people call time famine, like you're starving for time.
Totally.
If you report being time famished, that's as bad a hit to your well-being as if you self-report being unemployed. So like lose your job tomorrow, probably a big hit on your happiness. It's the same if you're just busy all the time.
Wow.
And I think this is a big one that parents get wrong when it comes to teenagers and middle schoolers, and probably a distinction of what it was like to grow up in the 90s. Like I had a lot of free time on my hands. I would goof around with friends. Like I studied and stuff, but like there was free time. I feel like I look at today's 12-year-old schedules and like there's no it's like, practice in the morning, then you go to school, then you go this thing, and then we have play date, and then we do this, and it's like
and then I'm on
boom,
my
boom, boom,
screen,
boom, boom.
like my brain
And
never never a moment off,
Yeah.
That actually reminds me. So I've been thinking so much about the use of screens and how I think sometimes we lack a lot of specificity when we talk about screens and
Definitely.
technology. We make these casual generalizations about phones, and it's like, no, guys, the phone actually could do so many alleviating things.
Right. I mean, look at the things we've talked about so far, right? Social connection. I could use the phone as a phone, right? Like it's called iPhone. It's not called email or texting or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Like we could use it to connect with other people. We could use it to write in a gratitude journal. We could use it to use a meditation app, listen to a fantastic podcast. We feel transcendent awe at the wonderful stories that come out of stories that we tell and so on. But usually we're using it not to do any of those things. So much data looking at just the presence of phones and social connection. One study, again, by Liz Dunn, who I mentioned earlier, checks whether or not people who are on their phone connect less well, like in crowds. So you're in a waiting room and you either have access to your phone or not. What happens to smiling that happens in the room? And you see things like 30% less smiling just because and you get it, right? Like if I had my phone in the waiting room, I'd be clicking on my phone.
You're not
look
smiling
at
your
people.
phone.
But like multiply that by like walking around in New York City with these phones, right? And just the positive emotion, right? And so I think what we don't often realize is that our screens and our phones are opportunity costs on other things, whether that's connecting with people in real life, whether that's just being present to notice like the beautiful autumn weather that we experience, or just like things in nature, things around us. Being with our own thoughts so we can be present with our emotions, be they good or bad. So I think you're totally right, Penn, that like we could be using our phones in all these happiness-inducing ways. Problem is we don't.
And that's because of design as well. I think we should recognize.
The happiness-inducing ways,
stacked against us.
They don't always make as much money as the not happiness-inducing ways.
Never. It all goes back to capitalism, doesn't it?
It does indeed.
It's just the fact that we don't know what it's like to sit and just let your brain be in a continuous train of thought anymore. It's like this phone interrupts so frequently. I mean, that has to be doing something to like just everything.
Yeah,
Happiness
I mean, there's
included.
lots of evidence that we don't get bored as much, right? Because we just pull out our phone, which has all these kind of fascinating economic indicators. One of my favorites is that sales of gum in grocery stores have gone down, like by like thousands of percentages. Like
Because
why?
people aren't bored.
Because when would you buy gum at a grocery store?
Yeah.
You're just standing in line, you're looking around, you see the gum. Now no one sees the gum because they're like looking at their phone, right? But that's like a stupid consequence. But for us, our creativity comes when we're bored. Our moments of like, oh, I should check in on that person, right? These positive pro-social thoughts come up when we're bored. There's so much that we're kind of losing by never having these moments. But what's worse is I think, the phones and what's on the other side of phones have done a good job of kind of beating out in real life when it comes to interestingness of kind of content or things to do.
Yeah.
So take, the kind of typical situation. I'm at dinner with my husband. My husband's this philosopher, another professor at Yale. He's awesome. So many interesting things we could say. But I could choose conversation with him or my phone, right? And even though if my phone is binging and doing things and giving me notifications, that's bad enough. But even my phone is just sitting there. I know that on the other side of that phone is some like really interesting stuff. In one episode where I interviewed this researcher, Liz Dunn, she mentioned this analogy. She's like, imagine if to dinner with my husband, instead of my phone, I took a wheelbarrow. And in that wheelbarrow was filled with printouts of my email since 1998, like photo albums that have gone back to like the early 2000s, like a bunch of videotapes of like celebrities doing things or porn or whatever.
Some porn on the side.
Like whatever. Like imagine the overflowing wheelbarrow. And like if I was at dinner with my husband and the wheelbarrow was there, I'd be like, oh man, I just want to like peek at this photo album. Or I just want to check my email from like whatever. like your brain isn't stupid. Your brain knows that on the other side of that device is that wheelbarrow.
Yeah.
And we expect to kind of stay as interested and as present within real life. And it's true, obviously, in real life can't compete with that. Even the best forms of in real life, like when you're at a Taylor Swift concert, or you're like, the parent who's there with your newborn baby interacting for the first time, right? Like we pull out our phones to kind of jump into that wheelbarrow so much that I think we're missing out on like real life and what the benefits that presence can provide.
Given that you apply not just like your own brain, but it seems like, you're part of this sort of network of people applying the sciences to this, to our happiness, and which has to do with our social evolution. How do you feel about the future?
I'm actually surprisingly hopeful in lots of ways. Again, because I see all these young people, I talk to them, right? I think they kind of have done the Wizard of Oz move of looking behind the curtain of so many of the structures and goals that we have that are kind of off kilter a little bit. And they've said, like, hang on, this seems wrong. This seems not right. I think they have very quickly clued into some of the problems of work-life culture, the problems of capitalism, the problems of the like hustle culture and the goals we've set for ourselves. And when I talk to them, I get hopeful because I think so many structural changes come from young people. And it seems like young people have figured this stuff out. And excitingly for me, in my like nerdy psychologist way, I think young people are really taken by the evidence, right? Like they hear that this isn't just a bunch of platitudes about being nice for other people and like doing things for others will make you happy and be present. They're like, no, there was a study, like, and they kind of resonate with that evidence-based approach. And that makes me hopeful that they're going to understand this stuff better and they're going to design structures that fix things.
And when you talk about these young people who you're both seeing in real life and also imagining in the future, do you see people who would describe themselves as happy or maybe galvanized by knowing that it's possible and sort of like needing to work towards it? Or those are interrelated probably.
Yeah. I mean, the sad thing is that younger generations right now are more unhappy than they have ever been, right? The mental health crisis that you see in college students is just like shocking in like how bad it is right now. And it's bad very recently. So the number of college students who are depressed has doubled since 2009,
Wow.
right? And that's not like, oh, it's less stigmatized now or da-da-da. Like these are like real numbers. And incidentally, talking about technology, if you map the number of young people who self-report being depressed at high school levels or college levels, and you map just like number of iPhones in pockets, like correlation doesn't equal causation, but like looks pretty bad. Something's up, right?
Just as an aside, have you read that book iGen, which sort of studied?
Yes,
I think it's such a good. I mean, I read that and I was like, yeah, it's the iPhone. It's like such a.
I mean, again, with like technology, we can use in lots of ways, but it would be nice to change the incentive structures that people make the apps on the technology.
Of course.
To like do
yes, this is never about technology. It's about the way it's designed within our.
But all that said, I think young people, in part because of that crisis, are really motivated to do something better, right? I mean, this is one of the reasons we need negative emotion, right? When you're sad, it prompts you to try to connect with people or do something different. When you're angry, it prompts you to take action in like social justice context and otherwise. Our negative emotions are catalysts for action. They're like putting our hand on a hot stove and we're like, ow, and you move your hand. Negative emotions say, hang on, this is not right. This doesn't feel good, and I need to make a change. So as devastating as the kind of current mental health crisis that we see in young people is, I actually think it'll be a catalyst for change. Change in two ways. Change for asking, okay, what really matters for my happiness? What can I really do to feel better? And then how can I change the structures so that they are better suited to kind of make me feel like I'm flourishing?
Yeah.
Maybe this is like a little bit of a hot take question, but that is it responsible to medicate people who are anxious about a world that is like socially ill, rather than like also creating spaces where people can think about how to change that world instead of become like numb to it? I've been seeing variations of that a lot recently.
Yeah.
And
I
really
wonder
talk
if you have
about their
thoughts
feelings
on that.
too.
Yeah.
To change it and talk about it as well. Like your experiences are valid.
I mean, this is an interesting ethical question, right? In so many domains, right? I'm often talking to middle schoolers and college students who are depressed and overwhelmed and burned out. And I know that's a lot because of the like college admission practices and the things, the structural expectations that are placed on them. I do a lot of work with doctors and who are experiencing unprecedented levels of burnout after COVID, right? And a lot of that has nothing to do with the fact that they're not meditating. It's just like, the like structures of the way the medical system works is just terrible, right? And so there's this ethical question about like, is it okay to be giving people these individual happiness strategies of like, okay, write in your gratitude journal and meditate every day when like, it's really much more the structures that are at fault. And one of the reasons I've come around to the fact that it is okay partly has to do with just like, the life raft situation of like, let me just, throw you a lifesaver so you can kind of get through this tough time. But beyond that, there is work looking at this question. You might even call it the sort of Pollyanna question of like, if I'm happy myself, will I just like ignore everything that's going on? I think of the like meme with the dog where he's like sitting in the fire and he's like, this is fine, right? If you're happy, are you more likely to say this is fine? And researchers have studied this. Konstantin Kushlev at Georgetown has some lovely work on this where he looks at, okay, who is taking action against climate change? Like, it's one thing to say you're really anxious about it, but it's another like go to protests and put solar panels up and donate and, like be sustainable. And what he finds is that individuals who self-report having less positive emotion or more mental health issues say they're more anxious about climate change, which kind of makes sense. Like anxious individuals are also anxious about climate change. It's a big thing to be anxious about. But if you look at who's taking action, it tends to be the people who self-report the most positive emotion. It's not the people who are most anxious about it, it's the people who feel better. He does the same thing with, for example, going to a Black Lives Matter protest. Who's taking action against social justice? It's the people who self-report feeling the least depressed, having the most positive emotion, and so on. And that, when you think about it, makes total sense. If you're just like totally depressed and you can't get out of bed and just feeling overwhelmed, even if you're just really busy, you're not doing any of the stuff to fix the terrible structural problems of the world. You got your own stuff you're dealing with.
Of course, yeah.
And this kind of fits with why some of these individual strategies might be a first step to kind of fixing some of the structural issues. It's not all this stuff, the advice I've just given isn't instead of fixing the structural stuff. It's in addition to it. And maybe as a first step to kind of give you the bandwidth and the self-care you need to sort of fight the big fights. And this is kind of really how I think about young people. I see, giving these kind of free resources out to young people with my course and the Sesame Street stuff as a like kind of giving them the resources they need to do this stuff later. It's not instead of, it's like it's like a necessary part of it. I think it's Audre Lorde. I'm going to mangle the quote, is like this idea of self-care as a political act.
Yeah.
And I think that all these happiness individual strategies are a political act. So it's emphasize. This isn't an instead of. This is a help you to kind of get the bandwidth needed to do the hard stuff, right?
Yeah.
We have this kind of incorrect notion of negative emotion, that it's like something bad. Definitely feels uncomfortable. I've been depressed, I've had sadness, I've been angry, like I've been frustrated, disappointed. It doesn't feel awesome, but it's telling you something important, right? It's a signal that you need to make a change. But the second thing is, I think we assume that like, because it feels awful, the only way to get rid of it is to suppress it, to kind of take a pill to avoid it. And the evidence suggests that might not be the best way to get out of all negative emotions, especially not necessarily if you're feeling clinically depressed or having panic attacks. Like there's certain thresholds that feel different, right? But for the kind of garden variety negative emotions, really the best way to get through them is to go through them, is to like sit with them and allow them and not suppress them and run away. Why do we know this? Well, we know emotion suppression is bad. It's bad. First of all, it doesn't really work, right? You're kind of like holding the beach ball underwater and eventually it's going to fly out. And if you're like my mom, it's going to hit your brother in the face, kind of like in the 12-year-olds in the pool kind of move, right? But also it's bad for our thinking. If you're suppressing your emotions, say like in a simple laboratory task, I bring you in, you watch some sad videos and I say, try to act like you're not feeling sad. You do worse on a memory test. You do worse on a decision-making task. Even that little laboratory test of suppressing your emotions from some dumb YouTube video, like you're seeing changes in your cognition and your thinking. You're also seeing changes in your body. You can see evidence of cardiac stress just from those simple moments of suppressing emotions. So it's not working and it's hurting us. But the other strategy we can use instead of suppressing our emotions and avoiding them is to say, hey, I'm going to sit and allow these emotions to be there just as it is. Spiritual traditions call this things like acceptance. It often goes by a practice of like allowing or urge surfing in the clinical literature. But, say you're just feeling really sad or you're feeling really lonely or you're pissed off. You just say, all right, I'm just going to sit with this and pay attention to it for like 5 minutes. It often, one practice that's been popularized by the meditation teacher Tara Brach goes by the acronym of RAIN, which stands for recognize, allow, investigate, and nurture. So bad emotions there, recognize. What is it? Is it overwhelm? Is it disappointment? Is it sadness with a side of pissed off? Like try to use your SAT words and like figure out what you're dealing with. But then you say the A step, which is allow, and you say, all right, I'm just going to sit here. The okay emotion, you go. It's kind of like when like the nosy neighbor comes by and you don't want to hang out with them, but you're like, you don't kick them out. Like it's like, all right, frustrated guest. All right, you're here. Let's chill. But you chill with this step of the I, which is investigate. You say, okay, I'm feeling pissed off. How does that feel in my body? What do I want to do when I feel pissed off? When I notice this, I want to like check my email. I want to look at my phone. I want to be anywhere but with that emotion. Don't act on it like, okay, but that's my brain's go-to when this emotion comes up. My chest gets tight. I'm furrowing my brow. And you're just like looking at it. And the way emotions work is they're kind of like waves. When you look at it, it might feel a little bit more intense, but like your body's not going to stay in that same state for a while. Like you're going to sort of get bored with it. It's going to kind of tail off. And so if you can just be there and investigate and stay with that urge, you can kind of get through it. But you don't stop there. The last step of this recognize, allow, investigate, and nurture RAIN is the nurture, which is like, all right, I sat through that emotion. How can I nurture myself? Maybe I got to call a friend. Maybe I got to take something off my plate. I got to do something nice for myself or someone else, right? Maybe it's like time to journal or meditate or whatever. How can I like take care of myself compassionately? Research shows that practices like RAIN improve burnout and things like burnout in first responders and healthcare workers. It's odd, like the strategy of actually like, I'm just going to sit with the terrible emotion now, sometimes can allow you to kind of let it run its course. I think the big problem with negative emotions is a lot of time we don't let it run its course, or we get in this sort of ruminative pattern where we're like, we don't just say, all right, I'm just going to sit with it, just like hang out with it and just deal with it right now.
Yeah,
you know?
what are... Because I totally can feel the difference and know what you mean and have experienced both. How does one differ? Like what are the factors that lead to somebody ruminating and wallowing, or raining? You know, like what's the?
I think part of it is like, well, first of all, I think we're busy, right? When I look at like when I'm suppressing my emotion, it's often because like, just don't time to deal with that right now. I just gotta move. Like, like that email came through and I'm really pissed, but my next meeting's walking in and like, parents for sure, right? Teenagers are just moving on to the next thing. Like, our life is running at a clip. And so it's very hard to take time to do that. But I think part of it is like, I think if I actually sit with this, I'm just like, I'm going to be destroyed. I'm not going to be able to handle it. I'm going to, I had this recently where I had like a kind of mean critique of one of our podcast episodes. It was actually along the lines of the social justice stuff we were talking about. Somebody was accusing that like, you talk about all these individual strategies, that means you're ignoring the structural stuff. And I was like, no, we just haven't had that episode wasn't about that, but I definitely, and so I was feeling really kind of attacked and sort of guilty. And I was like, you know what, I should take my own advice and sit with this. And like first 2 minutes, it sucked. I did not want to sit with what that felt like. But then like I noticed like, I can learn something about what it feels like. I definitely learned about my urges. I want to eat something. I want to like check my email. I want to, but then it's like, it took its course. And after I felt much more like, like it was like a kind of breath of fresh air, to simulate my like, middle school self. This might be TMI, but I used to have really terrible like menstrual cramps. And sometimes when the menstrual cramps end, it's like this like, so happy that's done. And that's kind of what I felt like with my emotions. It's like, I'm so happy. That's like, that's over with. That's great.
We talk about periods here all the time.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Period friendly
Welcome
podcast.
to the Podcrushed family.
Yeah.
We will let you go today. We promise. But there is one area that we haven't asked you anything about, and we did get a lot of questions. And what is the relationship between food, exercise, and happiness? Are there foods that make us more happy, less happy, sort of?
Yeah. And in the physical health domain, I'm going to add sleep because we're talking to middle schoolers. And I actually think one thing that if every middle schooler did today that would honestly alleviate the mental health crisis, it would be to get them to sleep. If they just slept 8 to 9 hours every night, I think we would not have the like mental health crisis that we have.
Is it the same for adults, do you think? 8 to 9 hours?
Yes, for sure. Adults can actually get a little bit less. In part, as we talked about before, middle schoolers' brains are building. You need some sleep to get your brains to build kind of well. But true for adults too, actually. One of the things I say to my college students, if you come in and you're feeling stressed and depression, anxious, I'm like, what's your sleep like? And what's your sleep hygiene like?
You must be such a compassionate teacher.
Because I'm like, you better sleep more.
No, I think you must be I feel like you're a very compassionate teacher.
Yeah. I mean, really... I see like, I can see myself in them and I know what they're capable of. And so, so anyway, so let's add sleep to the mix. But, and then let's do exercise. Tons of data, moving your body makes you feel better. There's some evidence in meta-analyses, which are these big like studies of studies where you like pool all the data together, that just like getting in, a half hour of cardio every day can be as good as a prescription of an antidepressant medication for reducing depression symptoms and reducing anxiety symptoms. And I'll say about both of these things, sleep and exercise, they're often the first things to go for teens too, right?
Yeah.
You get busy, you stop sleeping, and you skip the workout, right?
Yeah.
And that's like actually the time we need it most.
Yeah.
On food, I think food is tricky because like nutrition scientifically is just very messy. But I think the fast version is like generally treating our bodies better makes us feel better. And so I'm careful about talking about food because sometimes if I say, oh, food matters for happiness, I think a like incredibly restrictive approach to food where you're really focused on it and obsessed about it, like that's bad, right? In fact, you'd be better off just eating whatever you wanted and giving yourself permission and self-compassion to eat whatever you wanted. But if you can, without like the crazy restriction mindset, like deal with what you're eating and feed yourself more intuitively, feed yourself stuff that makes your body feel good. Again, even saying like healthy stuff or non-processed food makes us get into like restriction mindset. But if you're just like feeding yourself what feels good to your body and paying attention to whether or not it feels good to your body, lots of evidence that matters for your happiness, matters for your functioning, matters for everything. And so I think we forget that mental health is physical health. So things like exercise, food, and sleep really matter. But again, the key is to do that not in like this very type A way. I worry about that because I see my Yale students all the time where I give some suggestion. It's like, okay, I will gratitude journal every day and I will do it exactly at 7 p.m. and I will flagellate myself if I ever forget to do, and definitely this happens in context with food and exercise, especially with teens, right? So got to be careful. But in general, promoting things that feel good to your bodies will end up making your mental health better off too.
I think we've just got to ask our final question, which is a personal one. If you could go back to 12-year-old Laurie, what would you say or do?
Well, I think best case scenario is I could go back with like a time machine and I'd be able to sort of bring like a laptop or something that could plug into like, 1980s, late early 90s thing. But I'd honestly give her a copy of my course. I'd be like, learn this stuff. And I wouldn't tell her it was mine because I guess she'd maybe see me. I don't know. She probably wouldn't think I was me, but in any case. Yeah. But I would try to give her the tips that I give to not my college students, but these teenagers using the Science of Wellbeing for Teens class. I would teach her this stuff that would hopefully convince her that they're, I'm sorry in middle school you didn't get these strategies, but those strategies are there. These are skills that you can build over time to take care of your and other people's emotional health. Hey, here are the skills, listen to them, and good luck. And I would also bring her a sample of really nice curly hair conditioner to be like, stop brushing and blow drying the hair. Just put this in after the shower every day. I'd be like, here's this wonderful class, and here's a little, boost of Lush Product Revive hair cream. Bye.
Recognize, accept, investigate, and nurture your hair. That's all you have. You can follow Dr. Laurie Santos on Instagram at Laurie Santos Official or at Laurie Santos on Twitter. Her podcast, The Happiness Lab, is available wherever you listen to podcasts. You can take her class, The Science of Wellbeing, on Coursera. Coursera? Coursera.
The same thing happened to me when I turned 13. I was like very thin and had straight hair, and I suddenly gained like 25 pounds in like a week, and my hair got really frizzy. It was like the wildest.
Like literally that thing. I was like, what happens in hormones? Like when the like thing kicks and it's like poof. But yeah, terrible stuff.